The Interstellar Defense Academy had been processing cadets for 317 years, with the kind of methodical precision that only institutional bureaucracy could achieve. 3 centuries of testing, evaluating, sorting, and occasionally rejecting the best and brightest from 47 member species of the galactic concordance. 3 centuries of data points, statistical models, and carefully maintained bell curves that told the selection committee exactly what to expect from every species that walked through those reinforced doors. The testing facility on Kepler's station occupied an entire wing of the orbital platform. A sprawling complex of examination rooms, simulation chambers, and the kind of waiting areas that seemed specifically designed to make anxious teenagers even more anxious, regardless of how many limbs they had. The walls were that particular shade of institutional beige that apparently translated across all known color perception spectrums as equally depressing. Motivational posters in 17 different languages proclaimed things like "excellence through discipline" and "your potential is limitless," with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tax documentation. At the heart of this bureaucratic labyrinth sat the neural response quantifier, Mark 7. And if machines could be smug, this one would have been insufferable. 3 meters of polished titanium alloy, quantum processors, and more sensors than a paranoid spaceship. The NRQ-7 represented the pinnacle of reflexive measurement technology. It had tested over 4 million cadets. It had never malfunctioned. Its margins of error were so small, they required scientific notation to express properly. The manufacturer's warranty had expired 200 years ago, not because the machine had failed, but because the manufacturer had gone out of business for entirely unrelated reasons involving financial fraud. The machine, however, kept working perfectly. Senior Proctor Velnoth regarded the NRQ-7 with the kind of affection some people reserved for particularly reliable appliances. In his 43 years administering entrance examinations, he had seen every possible variation of cadet performance. He had seen Vrexian candidates with their genetically enhanced neural pathways score in the 97th percentile with metronomic consistency. He had watched Kolthari applicants approach the test with mathematical precision, their 4-lobed brains processing the sequences with all the passion of a particularly efficient calculator. He had even consoled a few Pelian youngsters whose gelatinous nervous systems simply could not fire fast enough to meet the minimum threshold, though they always took rejection with admirable grace. Mostly because Pelians took everything with admirable grace. It was their whole thing. The test itself was elegantly simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. Cadets would interface with the NRQ-7 through a neural tap, a non-invasive crown of sensors that read electrical impulses in the brain. The machine would then present a series of stimuli, visual and auditory patterns that required instant recognition and response. The difficulty scaled automatically, adjusting to each candidate's performance in real time. Press the button when you see red. Don't press when you see blue. If you hear the high tone, press twice. If the triangle rotates clockwise, press 3 times, but only if the background is green. The sequences became progressively more complex until the machine found the candidate's ceiling. That beautiful moment where neurology met its limitations and the system could assign a precise numerical value to their reflexive capacity. The minimum threshold for admission was 72 out of 100. It was not a particularly cruel standard. The concordance needed competent peacekeepers, not superhumans. Well, not literal superhumans anyway. Figurative superhumans were fine. Exceptional performers scored in the high 80s. The record, held by a Vrexian candidate named Thexilor, was 91.7. That record had stood for 26 years. There was a plaque in the lobby commemorating it, right next to the plaque commemorating the facility's perfect safety record and the plaque commemorating that one time a visiting dignitary had called the cafeteria food surprisingly edible. Today was processing day 4047, and Velnoth was experiencing the unique combination of boredom and vigilance that came from doing the same job with absolute competence for several decades. Morning testing had proceeded exactly as expected. A Vrexian candidate named Kexisthor had scored 89.2, which was high but not record-breaking, and had received his admission designation with the kind of nod that suggested this outcome had never been in doubt. A Kolthari applicant had achieved 76.4 after approaching the neural tap with what appeared to be a prayer in her native language, though it might have been a mathematical formula. With Kolthari, you could never really tell. The Pelian candidate had been a young fellow named Bloop, because apparently Pelian naming conventions involved sounds that their translator units rendered as onomatopoeia. Bloop had scored a 68.9, just shy of the threshold, and had oozed out of the testing chamber with what Velnoth's translation implant interpreted as philosophical acceptance of the universe's inherent unfairness. Velnoth had processed the rejection paperwork with genuine sympathy. Bloop seemed like good people. Bloop would probably do fine in civilian logistics. The next candidate was from Earth. Velnoth felt a slight uptick in interest, the way one might feel seeing an unusual cloud formation. Humans were still relatively new to the concordance, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 73 years ago through what the official reports described as innovative engineering, and what everyone else described as they did what to their propulsion system. Humanity's reputation in the galactic community was still being written, though certain themes had emerged. They were adequate pilots with terrible risk assessment capabilities. They had a disturbing tendency to solve problems through what they called improvisation, and what everyone else called, please stop touching things you don't understand. They laughed at inappropriate times, ate foods that would kill most other species, and had somehow domesticated persistence predators as companion animals, which explained a concerning amount about their psychology. The human walked into the testing chamber with the kind of casual confidence that immediately made Velnoth suspicious. His name was listed as Marcus Webb on the registration form, age 22 standard years, from someplace called Colorado. He was tall by human standards, lean in the way of persistence hunters, with dark hair and the kind of expression that suggested he found something privately amusing about this entire situation. "Good morning," Velnoth said in flawless concordant standard, his translator implant rendering the greeting in the appropriate human frequency range. "Please be seated in the examination chair. I will explain the procedure." Marcus sat down with an ease that suggested he had never been nervous about anything in his entire life, which Velnoth found statistically improbable but behaviorally consistent with human psychological profiles. He noted that the human's resting heart rate, displayed automatically on the biometric scanner, was 64 beats per minute, perfectly calm. Either this candidate had ice water in his veins or absolutely no idea what he was getting into. Velnoth launched into his standard explanation, the one he had delivered approximately 47,000 times with only minor variations for species-specific physiology. The neural tap would not hurt. The test would adapt to his performance level. He should respond as quickly as possible to each stimulus. There was no penalty for errors beyond the obvious consequence of a lower score. The entire process would take approximately 15 minutes. Did he have any questions? "Yeah, just one," Marcus said. And Velnoth prepared himself for the usual inquiries about bathroom breaks or whether the test could be rescheduled. "Is there like a high-score leaderboard? Because I'm very motivated by leaderboards." Velnoth's primary and secondary eyelids blinked in sequence, a gesture that his species used to indicate mild bewilderment. There is a recorded maximum score of 91.7 achieved by Cadet Thexelor 26 years ago. However, I should emphasize that you merely need to achieve 72 points to gain admission. Setting records is not the objective. Cool, Marcus said with a grin that Velnoth's cultural database flagged as confident bordering on cocky. Just wondering. The proctor lowered the neural tap onto the human's head, making minor adjustments for the species' relatively sparse cranial ridge structure. The sensors flickered to life, establishing baseline readings. Human neural patterns were interesting, Velnoth had to admit. More chaotic than Vrexian, faster than Pelian, with these odd periodic spikes that the medical literature attributed to something called internal monologue, that apparently never shut up. Humans thought constantly, even when there was nothing productive to think about. It seemed exhausting. Beginning test sequence in 3, 2, 1. The first stimulus package was always gentle, a warm-up designed to establish basic response parameters. Simple shapes, primary colors, straightforward audio cues. Marcus responded with casual efficiency, his fingers tapping the response pad with the kind of rhythm that suggested he might have done this sort of thing before. Though of course he had not. The NRQ-7 was unique to the Academy. Perhaps humans had similar assessment tools in their education system. They did seem obsessed with measuring everything. 30 seconds in, Marcus had scored perfectly on the introductory sequence. The machine automatically shifted to level 2 difficulty, introducing multi-stimulus packages and conditional responses. The human's performance did not waver. His response times hovered consistently around 180 milliseconds, which was solidly above average, but not yet concerning. Velnoth made a note that this candidate would likely achieve a comfortable passing score, probably somewhere in the mid-70s. Adequate. Unremarkable. Exactly what one expected from a species still learning its place in the broader galaxy. Level 3 activated at the 2-minute mark. This was where most candidates began to show strain, where the cognitive load increased enough that neural processing speed became the limiting factor. The patterns became complex, requiring not just recognition, but prediction. If A, then B, unless C has occurred in the last 3 seconds, in which case execute D, but only if the current sequence count is a prime number. Marcus's response time improved to 165 milliseconds. Velnoth's tertiary eyelid flickered. That was unusual. Candidates did not typically get faster as the difficulty increased. They plateaued, they struggled. They eventually hit their ceiling and began making errors. They did not accelerate. He leaned forward slightly, watching the data stream with increased attention. Perhaps an outlier performance. The statistical models allowed for those. Every few thousand candidates, someone exceeded expectations. It was mathematically inevitable. Level 4 arrived, and Marcus was maintaining 162 milliseconds with 97% accuracy. The 3% error rate was actually more reassuring than perfect accuracy would have been. Perfect scores at this level suggested either cheating or sensor malfunction, and the NRQ-7 did not malfunction. The machine was now presenting stimulus packages that required simultaneous processing of visual, auditory, and tactile information. Candidates needed to track 4 variables, predict pattern evolution, and execute responses that often contradicted instinctive reactions. Press the button when your brain is screaming not to press the button. Do not press when every neural pathway is firing signals to press immediately. The human was treating it like a particularly engaging mobile game. At the 5-minute mark, Level 5 activated automatically, And this was where Velnoth began to feel the first stirrings of what his species called unease, and what humans would have called, wait, what? Level 5 was the threshold where good candidates became great candidates. The Vrexian record holder had reached level 7 before hitting his ceiling. Most species never saw level 6. Level 5 was characterized by abstract pattern recognition, requiring candidates to identify mathematical relationships in seemingly random sequences while simultaneously tracking spatial positioning of multiple moving targets. Marcus's response time was now 151 milliseconds, and his accuracy had somehow improved to 98%. Proctor Velnoth? His assistant, a young Kolthari named Pixtal, looked up from her datapad with an expression that her facial structure rendered as confused geometry. The candidate's neural activity is increasing. This is not typical, correct? It was not typical. Neural activity was supposed to plateau as candidates reached their processing limits. The brain could only work so hard before hitting maximum capacity. That was basic neurology, consistent across every tested species. Yet the biometric readouts showed Marcus's brain activity climbing steadily, not in the panicked, scattered way of someone drowning in complexity, but in the focused, organized pattern of someone warming up. Level 6 emerged at minute 7, and other proctors in the facility began to notice. Testing Chamber 3 had gone quiet in a way that drew attention. Velnoth could see colleagues glancing through the observation window, their various sensory organs widening in expressions that universally translated to, "Is that supposed to be happening?" Level 6 introduced temporal distortion to the testing sequence. Stimuli appeared with irregular timing, forcing candidates to maintain constant vigilance while processing increasingly abstract patterns. The response windows narrowed to fractions of a second. Human neurology, according to every academic paper Velnoth had ever read, had an average reaction time of 200 to 250 milliseconds. This was biological fact, limited by nerve conduction velocity and synaptic transmission speed. Marcus was responding consistently at 142 milliseconds, and the number was still dropping. "This is incorrect," Velnoth said aloud, then immediately felt foolish because the machine did not make errors, and empirical reality did not care about his confusion. He pulled up the technical specifications for the NRQ-7, searching for some explanation, some footnote about human neurology that had missed. Perhaps their optic nerves were faster. Perhaps their motor cortex had some unusual efficiency. Perhaps the entire testing apparatus was catastrophically miscalibrated, though that seemed unlikely given that every other species had tested within expected parameters. Level 7 activated, and a small crowd had gathered outside the testing chamber. Word spread quickly through the facility when something unusual occurred, and this qualified as extremely unusual. The NRQ-7 was now presenting stimulus packages that existed at the theoretical edge of biological possibility. The patterns required predictive modeling, intuitive leaps, and response times that pushed against the physical limits of neural transmission. Thexeler, the record holder, had achieved level 7 and sustained it for 47 seconds before his accuracy dropped below acceptable thresholds. Marcus had been at level 7 for 90 seconds, and his response time was 134 milliseconds. The human's expression remained one of casual focus, the look of someone playing a challenging video game on a lazy afternoon. He had not even broken a sweat. His heart rate had elevated slightly to 78 beats per minute, which was barely above resting for a human engaged in light physical activity. He appeared to be having fun. "Should we stop the test?" Pixtal asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in her voice. The test was designed to be self-limiting. It found your ceiling and stopped. But the machine was still scaling difficulty because it had not found Marcus's ceiling, and they were entering territory that existed only in theoretical models. "No," Velnoth heard himself say. "Let it continue." Level 8 emerged at minute 11, and the NRQ-7 began making a sound that Velnoth had never heard before, a high-pitched whine that suggested cooling systems activating to handle increased processor load. This level was not supposed to be reachable. It existed in the code as a mathematical extreme, the asymptotic limit that proved the testing algorithm was theoretically sound. Actual biological organisms were not supposed to perform at level 8. It required response times below 130 milliseconds, pattern recognition that bordered on precognition, and the ability to maintain perfect accuracy while processing 17 variables simultaneously. Marcus hit 127 milliseconds and maintained it for 30 seconds before pushing down to 124. Warning indicators began appearing on Velnoth's terminal. The machine was flagging impossible results, asking for verification that the neural tap was properly connected. Running diagnostic subroutines to check for sensor errors, every diagnostic came back clean. The sensors were functioning perfectly. The data was accurate. The human was simply performing at a level that the machine had been programmed to consider physically impossible. Senior Proctor Thaxven, a Vrexian with enough years of service to remember when the NRQ-7 was the NRQ-Vic, pushed his way through the growing crowd of observers. "Explain what I am seeing, Velnoth." "The human is breaking the test, sir." "Tests do not break. Species have limitations. Find the limitation." Level 9 activated, and the cooling system whine became a sustained shriek. The NRQ-7 was designed to handle one candidate at a time, running assessments that taxed perhaps 40% of its processing capacity in worst-case scenarios. It was now operating at 91% capacity, devoting nearly all available resources to generating stimulus packages complex enough to challenge whatever was happening inside Marcus's skull. The patterns being displayed were beautiful in an abstract, mathematical way, the kind of sequences that would make theoretical neurologists weep with joy. Assuming theoretical neurologists were prone to weeping, Marcus's response time bottomed out at 119 milliseconds and held steady with 99% accuracy. The 1% error rate, Velnoth realized with growing horror, was probably due to hardware limitations rather than human limitations. The response pad could only register inputs so quickly. The neural tap could only read signals so precisely. They were testing the limits of the machine, not the limits of the candidate. "What is his brain doing?" Thaxven demanded, staring at the biometric readouts that showed neural activity patterns unlike anything in the database. Humans were not supposed to be able to push their consciousness into overdrive like this. They were supposed to be limited by biology, by evolution, by the same physical constraints that governed every other species. "He is hunting," Velnoth said quietly, and suddenly it made terrible sense. Humans were pursuit predators from a death world. They had evolved to track prey across vast distances, to predict movement, to throw projectiles at moving targets with lethal accuracy. Their entire neural architecture was optimized for rapid visual processing, spatial reasoning, and hand-eye coordination. They had developed complex tool use because their survival depended on hitting small, fast-moving targets from distance. They had not evolved to be strong or armored or venomous. They had evolved to be fast and precise and relentless. And Marcus was not being tested. He was playing. This was entertainment for him. Level 10 emerged at minute 14, and the NRQ-7 began to smoke. It was not dramatic smoke, not the billowing clouds of a catastrophic failure, but rather a thin, acrid stream from the processor housing that suggested components were operating beyond thermal specifications. Emergency cooling systems activated with a thunk that echoed through the testing chamber. The stimulus patterns being generated now existed purely in theoretical space. mathematical constructs that no biological organism should be able to perceive, let alone process. Marcus was still going, his response time holding at 119 milliseconds, his accuracy somehow maintaining 99%, despite the fact that the test had transcended biological reality and entered the realm of pure information processing. "Shut it down," Thaxvin ordered, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of service and absolute certainty that this situation had spiraled beyond acceptable parameters. "Sir, the test has not determined his ceiling because he does not have one. Not one that this machine can measure. Shut it down before we have to explain to the Oversight Committee why we destroyed a 300-year-old piece of equipment testing a human." Velnoth reached for the emergency stop. But before his manipulator could touch the control, the NRQ-7 made a sound like dying electronics. A descending whine, a series of angry beeps, and then silence. The screens went dark. The neural tap retracted automatically, its safety protocols executing even as the main system failed. Smoke continued to drift from the processor housing in lazy spirals. Marcus sat in the examination chair, blinking slightly, his expression shifting from focus to mild concern. The testing chamber had gone completely silent, every observer frozen in various poses of shock, dismay, and existential confusion. The human looked at the dead machine, then at Velnoth, then back at the machine. "Was that fast enough?" he asked, and his tone suggested genuine uncertainty rather than sarcasm, which somehow made it worse. The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, which was appropriate because the NRQ-7 was definitely dead. Small electrical sparks danced across the processor housing. The cooling fans were making a sound that suggested they had given up on life. 317 years of perfect operation, 4 million successful assessments, and one human from Colorado had murdered it through sheer, unintentional competence. Thaxvin made a sound that the translator rendered as existential groaning and walked away, presumably to begin drafting the incident report that would haunt his bureaucratic nightmares for months. The crowd of observers began to disperse, some heading back to their duties, others pulling out communication devices to spread word of what had just happened, because apparently even highly trained military proctors were not immune to gossip. Velnoth looked at the human, who had stood up from the examination chair and was stretching in the way humans did, all casual joint rotation and apparent obliviousness to the chaos he had caused. The proctor's training, his decades of experience, his carefully maintained professional composure, all of it crystallized into a single response that felt entirely inadequate for the situation, but was all he had. "You passed." "Cool," Marcus said, grinning. "What's my score?" The question was reasonable. The answer was complicated. Velnoth pulled up the final data capture before the NRQ-7 had experienced what the technical readout was diplomatically calling catastrophic processing failure. The last recorded performance metrics showed response times of 119 milliseconds, accuracy of 99%, sustained operation at level 10 for 43 seconds, and a projected score that the algorithm had calculated before the hardware had given up in despair. "Your score is 127.4, Velnoth said, and the number felt absurd even as he spoke it. Scores above 100 were not supposed to be possible. The scale was designed to encompass all biological variation across known species. A score of 100 represented theoretical perfection, the mathematical limit of neural performance. Marcus had exceeded theoretical perfection by 27.4 points, which suggested either the theory was wrong or the human was wrong. And humans were standing right there, being empirically real, so probably the theory needed work. "Is that good?" Marcus asked. and Velnoth's translator implant briefly considered shutting down in solidarity with the dead testing machine. The previous record was 91.7, Pixatal said from her workstation, her voice carrying the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to very young children. You have exceeded it by approximately 39%. Oh. Marcus processed this information with visible thought, his expression shifting through several human micro-expressions that the cultural database suggested meant pleased, but trying not to be obnoxious about it. That's pretty good then. Pretty good. The human had just obliterated 3 centuries of performance data, destroyed a piece of irreplaceable testing equipment, and forced the Academy to confront the unsettling reality that their assessment models might be catastrophically inadequate for evaluating his entire species. And his response was pretty good. Over the next 6 hours, the testing facility descended into organized chaos. Technicians swarmed the NRQ-7, poking at its corpse with diagnostic tools and increasingly pessimistic expressions. Senior administrators materialized from offices that Velnoth had not realized existed, demanding explanations in 17 different languages, all of which translated to, "What did you do to my perfect testing record?" Marcus was escorted to a waiting area where he was provided with snacks, water, and a growing stack of liability waivers that the legal department kept producing like some kind of bureaucratic magic trick. The medical team arrived to conduct a full physiological workup because apparently some administrators suspected that Marcus might be a cyborg, or genetically modified, or possibly not human at all, but rather some kind of advanced artificial intelligence in a meat suit. The tests came back depressingly normal. Standard human neurology, unmodified genetics, baseline muscle density consistent with someone who exercised regularly, but not obsessively. He was not a freak of nature. He was just a human with good reflexes and a competitive streak. Which was, several neurologists realized with dawning horror, probably representative of his entire species. Dr. Zix Kaur, the facility's chief medical officer and a Pelian who had devoted her entire career to understanding neurophysiology, delivered her preliminary findings to a hastily convened review board, with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from being professionally vindicated in the worst possible way. Humans are persistence predators from a Class 4 death world, she began, her gelatinous form rippling in what her species used to indicate. I told you this would be a problem. Their evolutionary history involved chasing prey animals to exhaustion over distances of up to 40 kilometers in extreme heat. They developed advanced thermoregulation through sweat, bipedal locomotion for efficiency, and neurological adaptations that prioritize endurance and accuracy over raw power. She pulled up a holographic display showing human neural pathways, highlighting the connections between visual cortex, motor control, and decision-making centers. Their brains are optimized for throwing projectiles. This seems trivial until you understand the computational complexity involved. To accurately throw a spear at a moving target requires real-time calculation of trajectory, windage, target velocity, and projectile characteristics, all executed in fractions of a second. Humans evolved to do this instinctively. They developed sports based on throwing and hitting balls, traveling at high velocities. Their children play games that involve rapid visual processing and hand-eye coordination for entertainment. Thaxaven, who was leading the review board and looking like he had aged 10 years and 6 hours, gestured for her to continue with a manipulator that trembled slightly. The candidate, Marcus Webb, is not exceptional by human standards. He's fit, trained, and motivated. But he is not a genetic outlier. Our preliminary research into human athletic competitions suggests that his reflexes are approximately in the 85th percentile for his species. She paused, letting that information sink in like cold water. Which means that 15% of humans would likely perform as well or better on the NRQ-7, assuming we could build another one that they would not immediately destroy. The implications rippled through the review board like a shockwave through a damaged hull. If this was normal for humans, if they routinely operated at speeds that the galaxy had assumed were impossible, then every assessment model, every training protocol, every strategic assumption about human capabilities needed to be revisited. They had admitted humanity to the concordance, assuming they were a standard Class 3 species with moderate physical capabilities and adequate cognitive function. They had not realized they were accepting pursuit predators with neural architecture optimized for violence. "What do we do with him?" someone asked, and the question carried weight beyond its simple words. Marcus Webb was not the problem. He was the symptom of a much larger calibration issue. Velnoth, who had been sitting quietly through the entire review, finally spoke. "We do what we always do. We process his admission, assign him to a training cohort, and watch very carefully to see if he lives up to this initial assessment." He paused, considering his next words. "And we immediately begin designing new testing protocols that can actually measure human performance without experiencing catastrophic failure." "And the record?" Pixtal asked. "Do we acknowledge it officially?" The board members exchanged glances, engaging in the kind of silent communication that governing bodies used when they knew the answer but did not like it. Finally, Thaxvin sighed, a sound that his species usually reserved for accepting the heat death of the universe. "Yes, we acknowledge it. We put up a new plaque. We explain to the Concordance Oversight Committee why we need funding for a new testing machine. And we hope that the next human who walks through our doors has at least the decency to stay below 100. The plaque went up 3 days later, right next to Thexilor's 26-year-old record. It read, "Highest recorded reflex assessment, Marcus Webb, human, 127.4 points. Please note that testing equipment may not accurately measure human performance. Proceed with caution." The "proceed with caution" part was not standard for commemorative plaques, but the legal department had insisted, and nobody had the energy to argue. Marcus graduated from the academy 8 months later with honors, having accumulated an impressive record of excellence combined with a concerning number of incident reports involving the phrase, "I didn't know it couldn't do that." He was assigned to a patrol frigate serving in the Outer Rim, where his reflexes saved his ship during a pirate engagement, when he successfully targeted and destroyed 3 incoming missiles that the ship's computer had flagged as unavoidable. The after-action report noted that he had executed the defensive maneuvers with 0.7 seconds to spare, which the tactical computer classified as statistically impossible but empirically verified. The Academy ordered 6 new testing machines from 3 different manufacturers, all of them with expanded performance ranges and reinforced processor cooling systems. The specifications explicitly mentioned they needed to handle extreme biological outliers with neural response times below 120 milliseconds. The manufacturers were confused but compliant. The machines cost 4 times as much as the old NRQ-7, but they did not burst into smoke when humans used them, which everyone agreed was an important feature. Human enrollment at the Academy increased by 40% over the next year, as word spread that humans apparently had natural abilities that other species found remarkable. The humans themselves seemed mostly confused by the attention, treating their reflexes the way one might treat having functional elbows, useful certainly, but hardly worth celebrating. This attitude both reassured and disturbed the faculty, because it suggested humans genuinely did not understand how abnormal they were, which meant they probably had other capabilities they had not bothered to mention. Velnoth retired 2 years later with full honors and a pension that allowed him to pursue his hobby of collecting ancient agricultural implements. which had nothing to do with testing protocols and therefore could not catastrophically fail. His replacement was a young, ambitious Kolthari who lasted 6 months before requesting a transfer to the much quieter Archives Division after a human cadet asked if there was a hard mode for the combat simulations. In the grand tapestry of galactic history, the incident barely registered as a footnote. The Concordants had weathered the inclusion of strange new species before. They had adapted to Vrexian genetic modification practices, Pelian philosophical approaches to warfare that involved apologizing while shooting, and Kolthari insistence on peer-reviewing every tactical decision. They would adapt to humans and their unsettling reflexes, their death-world resilience, and their habit of treating mortal danger as an interesting diversion. But in the quiet moments, when proctors trained new staff on the updated testing protocols, they always mentioned Marcus Webb. Not as a cautionary tale exactly, but as a reminder that the galaxy was large, biology was diverse, and sometimes a species evolved on a world harsh enough that their children's games would qualify as military training anywhere else. The new machines had upper performance limits built in, not because they expected candidates to reach them, but because institutional memory ran deep, and nobody wanted to explain to their supervisors why testing equipment had spontaneously decided to retire. The Narkevan itself was never repaired. It sat in storage for 3 months before being transferred to the Academy's museum, where it was displayed behind reinforced transparent aluminum with a small placard explaining its historical significance. Cadets on orientation tours would stop to look at it, this machine that had served flawlessly for 3 centuries before meeting something it could not measure. And occasionally, late at night when the museum was empty, maintenance staff swore they could still hear it making that high-pitched whine, as if the machine's ghost was still trying to calculate the impossible, still searching for the ceiling it had never found, still attempting to quantify exactly how fast enough really was. The answer, as it turned out, was faster than anyone had bothered to ask. The galaxy had spent 317 years perfecting a test that made one critical assumption. They had already encountered the fastest possible reflexes that biology could produce. They had measured Vrexian enhancement, Kolthari precision, Pelian determination, and 44 other species variations on neural processing speed. They had built their models, refined their algorithms, and created a system that could accurately assess any candidate's potential. They had simply forgotten to account for the possibility that somewhere out in the unfashionable end of the galaxy, on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star, evolution had been conducting its own long-term experiment in neural optimization. Millions of years of throwing rocks at antelope, of tracking prey through tall grass, of calculating ballistic trajectories by instinct. All of it building toward the moment when a human would sit down in front of a testing machine and ask a question that would haunt Academy administrators for years to come. Was that fast enough? The universe, in its infinite capacity for irony, had provided an answer that nobody wanted to hear. No, because fast enough implied a limit, and limits were what you found when you tested other species. Humans, it seemed, you just had to watch and hope they did not break anything too expensive.